You can't build without a foundation, Neva. And I'm the foundation. You'll understand that in about 3 weeks. That was the last thing Grant had said to her, standing in the doorway of the studio that bore his name and held her work, and she had carried those words across 9 time zones and a long layover in Seattle to a wooden bench outside Kyoto Station, where she sat with one portfolio case, a phone she had not turned off yet, and less money than she liked to calculate. She had left Portland to escape the wreckage. She had chosen Kyoto because it was the one city where no one knew the Strand name, where no one had watched her stand in a conference room, while 3 investors listened to Grant explain why the designs were studio assets and not personal property, while she stood beside him in her good blazer and said nothing, because the lawyer had already confirmed she had signed the wrong documents in the right year. Grant had left 2 unread messages on her phone. She did not open them. The station behind her was enormous and modern, all glass and steel, and the air in front of it smelled of exhaust and green tea from a vending machine someone had propped against a pillar, and underneath that, something she couldn't name, warm cedar, maybe, or the particular heat a city gives off when it's held its breath through 100 summers and is simply tired of pretending otherwise. A message arrived. Not Darby. You landed? Landed, sitting outside the station, extremely jet-lagged and extremely broke. Okay, so. A pause. Neva had known Darby since their MFA program, which meant she recognized the pause. Darby's pauses were never good news. There's a small situation with the Mitsui position. Neva sat up straighter. How small? It was rescinded. Budget cuts, they said, but also I think they found out about you and Grant and the dissolution, and they didn't want complications. It's a very industry small world story, and I'm so sorry. The August heat pressed down. Neva had one plan when she'd booked the flight, one promised job, one studio to land in while she found her footing. Now it was gone before she'd crossed the intersection from the station. Darby. I know, but listen. There's something. Pages rustled. Mori Studio. Traditional Nishijin weaving, 5th generation, same family for over a century. My friend Hana's uncle supplies their dye materials, and he says the whole place is falling apart from the inside. Their lead designer walked off last month with no explanation. And the owner, Darby dropped her voice. The owner is Kenji Mori, Mori Textile. You've seen their work in the Costume Museum catalogue. Neva had. Nishijin Ori brocade, the heavy silk weave that had dressed Kyoto for 4 centuries. The Mori bolts had been in the catalogue under the heading Living Tradition, textiles in dialogue with the past. She had turned those pages 3 times. He needs someone by Friday. There's a board presentation, investors deciding whether to sell the workshop to a luxury group called Orsini. Hana's uncle says Mori has been fighting the sale for 2 years, and this is the last chance, and without a designer, he has nothing to show them. I don't have working papers yet. I know. I have a room for 4 nights. I know. Darby breathed out. Neva, you are a textile designer with a portfolio case. In 4 days he has a workshop with no designer and a Friday deadline. Do you see how the math is being kind? The math, Neva said, has a very strange definition of kindness. But she was already standing, already pulling the case upright, because the alternative was sitting on this bench until her 4 nights ran out and her money ran out after them. Give me the address. The taxi that cost too much took her along the Kamo River, through streets that narrowed as the afternoon softened, where persimmon-colored walls gave onto small gardens, and the sound of wooden looms came occasionally through open windows. Mori Studio announced itself without a sign. It occupied a machiya, a Kyoto merchant townhouse, the kind with a facade barely wider than a doorway that opened back and back into deep, cool rooms. On a lane so narrow, the driver shook his head and left her at the corner. The walls were dark cedar, gone silver with age. A Noran curtain in indigo and white, geometric and uncompromising, hung in the threshold, and behind it came a sound Neva knew in her chest before she could name it, the rhythmic thump and click of a working loom. She pushed aside the Noran. Inside, stone floors, the temperature dropping 10 degrees, a long room where the ceiling was hung with bolts of silk in every stage of completion, cream, saffron, deep persimmon, and at the far end, past 2 weavers bent over their frames, a man was standing at a work table examining a length of fabric. He was perhaps 38, with the kind of focused stillness that comes not from calm but from having decided. Long ago, that distraction was too expensive. He held a section of silk up to the window light with both hands. He did not look up when she entered. "We are not accepting visitors today," he said in careful English, "or any day currently, if I am honest." "I'm not a visitor." Neva set the portfolio case against the wall. My name is Neva Strand. I trained at RSD. I've been in textile design for 8 years. I understand you need someone by Friday. He lowered the silk. He looked at her with the direct appraisal of someone who has been given too many things that turned out to be something else entirely. You heard this from whom? A dye supplier, a friend, a very small world. Something in his jaw tightened, which she would later understand was the closest he came to a smile in the first hour of knowing anyone. Miss Strand, I am Kenji Mori. Our last designer left without completing a commission that has a board presentation attached to it in 4 days. The commission requires someone who understands not only how to make a pattern beautiful on paper, but how to make it true in thread. Those are different skills. He looked at the portfolio case. What is in that? 8 years of patterns I built myself, dated by hand. She held his gaze, and I can tell the difference. He studied her the way a loom studies a new thread, measuring tension, weight, whether it will hold. Then he gestured toward the work table. Show me. She opened the case and laid out 3 pieces. A woven sample she'd done by hand the winter before, a jacquard repeat she'd designed but never produced because Grant had tabled it for budget reasons, and a small section of silk she'd annotated in the margins with thread counts and warp density notes. Kenji looked at all 3 without touching them. Then he picked up the hand-woven sample and turned it over to examine the back. The back of a weave tells the truth. Any designer knows this. A clean back means the weaver understood the structure, not just the surface. Neva's back was clean. The warp here, he said. You changed the tension at the 3rd repeat. The yarn had inconsistent twist. I adjusted rather than starting over. He set it down. He was quiet a moment. The commission is a bolt of silk, 3 meters, woven in the traditional Nishijin method, to be presented Friday as evidence of what this workshop can still produce that a factory cannot replicate. The pattern must be ours. Something that tells a story about this place, this craft, the people who have done this work for 5 generations. And it must do that in front of 3 people who are already predisposed to believe the story is over. His voice was flat, not cruel, simply factual, the way a man reports weather. Our last designer did not understand the difference between a pattern that is beautiful and a pattern that is an argument. I cannot afford to explain that difference again to someone and watch them fail to hear it. Neva thought of the conference room in Portland, the investors listening to Grant's voice, her designs on the pitch deck, her hands folded in her lap. What is the argument? She said. He looked at her. That this workshop is alive, not preserved. That the craft is not a museum piece but a living conversation between generations. That a machine can copy the surface but cannot know the reason for it. Then the pattern cannot be decorative, Neva said. It has to be structural. Something that only makes sense when you understand why each choice was made. She turned to the nearest bolt overhead, persimmon silk, half completed. What was she making? My grandmother's pattern. A commission we accept every 3 years from a family in Kanazawa. The order was placed before our designer left. Can I look at the draft? He brought it. She studied it for 3 minutes without speaking. The loom clicked. One of the weavers, a boy, maybe 19, all elbows and concentration, glanced up at her and then back at his work. The repeat here, she said, pointing. It's too regular. Nishijin brocade at this level traditionally introduced a small deliberate irregularity. A wabi element to mark that a human hand made it. Yours doesn't have one. It's technically correct and emotionally dishonest. The room went very quiet. That, Kenji said, after a moment, is what she never understood. He was quiet for 3 more seconds. Then, can you be here at 7 tomorrow morning? She thought of her 4 nights and her dwindling funds and the portfolio case that was all she had. Yes, she said, I can. He put her in a small room above the workshop because Mrs. Horio, a compact, silver-haired woman who had been managing Mori accounts for 26 years and had the particular authority of someone who has outlasted every crisis the family ever produced, had taken one look at Neva's face and decided something without consulting anyone. The room was small and honest. A futon, a low table, a window that opened onto a back garden where a persimmon tree held its fruit in the last of the afternoon light. Someone had left a folded towel on the sill and 3 stems of moss-green hydrangea in a cup. Neva did not ask who, she suspected. She did not want to cry in front of a cup. She sat on the edge of the futon and looked at her phone. Grant's voicemail still glowed at the top of the screen, unplayed, like a coal she had carried across the Pacific and kept meaning to put down. The phone buzzed. Not the voicemail, a live call. Grant's name filling the screen the way he had once filled every room he entered, large and warm and sure of his welcome. She should not pick it up. She knew, with the same clarity she knew when a thread was about to break, that she should not pick it up. She picked it up because some traitor part of her was still waiting to hear him say he had been wrong. Neva. His voice was exactly what it had always been, warm, easy, a little surprised that she'd answered, the way a person is surprised when the door opens after they've stopped expecting anyone home. Finally, "Your mother," said Asia. "I assumed you'd be back by now." "I'm working," she said. "What do you want, Grant?" "I want you to stop disappearing and have an adult conversation. Look," and here the warmth thinned the way it always did once he thought the door was open. "I'm relaunching the studio, new name, same address. I've got 3 clients signed and the Alderman account is coming back. They liked your patterns, Neva. They've asked for work in the same direction." The room tilted slightly. "The same direction," she repeated. "Our direction. The visual language we built together. I want you back. Head designer. Your name in the process where it matters, even if it's not on the masthead right now. You know how these things go." She knew how these things went. She had known for years and had called it collaboration, and then called it compromise, and then stopped calling it anything at all, because naming it meant she had to do something about it. "No," she said. "Neva." "No. Reopen your studio. Use whatever you can reconstruct from the pitch decks you saved, because you never once kept a process file." "I did." Her voice was steady in a way that surprised her. The hydrangea bent slightly in the evening air coming through the window. "Every pattern I made is dated and annotated in my handwriting in 8 sketchbooks sitting in the bottom of a portfolio case in a room you have never been in. Those go with me. So does everything I make from here. That's the news, Grant. That's what I wanted you to hear from me." He was quiet for the span of a breath. "That's not how intellectual property works when there's a partnership structure. Then your lawyers will have a very boring time explaining to a court why your name is on the structure, and mine is on all the actual work." She was standing now, at the window, the evening warm on her face, the persimmon tree going gold in the last of the light. "Don't call again." She pressed end before the traitor part of her could hesitate, found his name in her contacts and blocked it. Then she opened the voicemail she had carried 9 time zones without playing, and deleted it unheard. The little notification at the top of her screen went out. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat on the windowsill until they steadied, and below her, somewhere in the workshop beneath her feet, a loom was still running. Mrs. Horio, she would later learn, who kept the floor loom going until 9 every night, because she had decided, decades ago, that silence in a weaving studio was a kind of surrender. 2 precise knuckles on the door. "Miss Strand." Kenji's voice, careful, as though he too found the top floor unfamiliar. "The studio boy tells me you promised to look at the jacquard draft this evening, and then disappeared." Neva looked at her steady hands. She looked at the portfolio case, with its 8 soft-cornered sketchbooks. Then she opened the door. He stood in the narrow corridor in a linen shirt, sleeves rolled once, his one concession to the end of the workday, and looked at her face for a moment with the particular attention of someone who has learned to read weather quickly. He said nothing about what he read. He turned for the stairs. At the work table, she spread the draft and made him look at it with her. She talked about the wabi element, about the specific count she'd add, about the way the repeat needed to breathe before it resolved. The studio boy, Kyoto, 19, raised in this workshop since he was 11, leaned over her shoulder and quietly got his own pencil and began marking what she said. "The board presentation," she said to Kenji, not looking up. "What do they need to see to vote against the sale?" "Something they cannot put a number on." He was at the edge of the table, arms folded, watching her hands. "The Orsini Group has numbers. Very good numbers, clean and correct, and entirely missing the point in the way that numbers sometimes do." He was quiet a moment. "This workshop has made cloth for tea ceremony robes, for shrine offerings, for the obi of a Kyoto bride every other spring for 140 years. Orsini would keep the name on a label and make the cloth in a facility outside Osaka by machine at 1/3 the cost. They are not wrong that it is more efficient. They are simply wrong about what efficiency is for." Neva set down her pencil. She looked at the bolts overhead, the persimmon order, the cream silk waiting to be warped, the dark indigo at the far end she had not yet been near. "The indigo," she said. "What is it?" "My grandmother's." He said it without decoration, her last piece. She was working a pattern based on the view from this room in winter, the garden, the persimmon tree bare, when she became ill. She left 3 meters unfinished on the frame. A pause. "Mrs. Horio moves it to the high shelf in summer. In winter she brings it back down and adds an inch to it. She has done this for 11 years. Why? He was quiet for a moment. My grandmother said a piece of cloth is a promise. You begin it for someone. If the someone does not come, you keep it ready until they do. His voice did not change, which was how Neva knew it mattered. Mrs. Horio does not explain herself on the subject. I have learned not to ask. Neva stood very still with the persimmon light on the walls and the smell of silk and indigo around her, and understood three things at once. That the workshop was not a business Kenji was trying to save, but a promise his family had made to a craft and to the people who had trusted them with it. That the board presentation needed to make 3 people feel the weight of that promise, and that the woman running a loom at 9 o'clock at night had been making that argument every single winter for 11 years, 1 inch at a time. I know what the pattern is, Neva said. He looked at her. The presentation can't be a performance of preservation. It has to be evidence of continuation, something that shows the craft is still in conversation with the present, not frozen in a cabinet. She was thinking fast, the image assembling itself the way a pattern assembles before you've consciously chosen the thread. Your grandmother's commission. I finish it, not exactly as she would have, because I'm not her, and pretending otherwise is exactly what the Orsini pitch does with culture. I finish it as someone taught by her work, who can trace every choice she made and answer it with one of my own. The dialogue is the argument. The cloth is the evidence that someone is still here to have it. The room held the silence. Then Kenji said very quietly, "You would need to understand her language first. I've been reading it since I walked in." She nodded at the hanging bolts, the drafts, the half-finished loom in the corner. I'd need until Thursday to say something back to it worth presenting. He looked at her with the measuring look, checking tension, checking truth. Thursday, he said. Then we will see. By Thursday, the workshop smelled of the last stages, warm metal under thread tension, the faint char of indigo being fixed, the particular clean sweetness of silk, handled by someone who knows what they are doing. Neva had slept in 4-hour intervals, worked in the hours between, and let herself be corrected by Mrs. Horio twice. Once on her warp tension, once on a threading error she would not have caught for another 12 inches, and accepted both corrections without argument. That was how she understood, later, that the studio had made its decision about her faster than Kenji had. On Wednesday evening, a woman came down the studio stairs. Neva heard her before she saw her, heels on stone, deliberate, and the quality of presence that precedes a person by 3 steps. She was perhaps 42, dressed in the kind of understated perfection that requires equal amounts of money and indifference. Her dark hair smooth as poured ink. She took in the studio with the brisk appraising efficiency of someone accustomed to naming the value of things. "Mori-san." She kissed the air near his cheek, European style, which landed in the room with a small jolt of something out of register. Her English was fluent and faintly cool. "You didn't tell me you'd found someone." She looked at Neva. "I am Rei Nakamura. I represent the Orsini Group's interest in this studio." "Neva Strand. I'm working on the presentation." Rei looked at the cloth on the frame. 3 meters of silk, the wabi element placed where Neva had argued it needed to be, the dialogue between the grandmother's pattern and her own still emerging from the right margin. "That is ambitious," Rei said, and her tone completed the sentence, "and inadvisable. Miss Strand, you should know that Orsini's board is bringing their own design consultant to observe Friday's presentation, Hiroshi Abe. You will know him." Neva knew him. 2 Textile Institute Awards, a Paris House collaboration, the kind of career that opened museums. "I know his work," Neva said. "Then you understand the difficulty." Rei's voice softened into something almost gentle, which was the part that cut. "This is a decision for a board, not a competition. But the board will naturally compare what they see here to what they see from the Orsini team. And an American designer who arrived 4 days ago, with whatever circumstances brought her here, is not going to change a narrative that this workshop cannot sustain itself." She set her tablet on the work table, a small territorial gesture. "I say this so you are not surprised on Friday. I have seen Mori-san hold this position for 2 years. He is principled, and it has cost him considerably. I would rather the person he has placed at the center of his argument understand what they have walked into." The studio had gone quiet. Kyoto had stopped moving the shuttle. Neva felt the heat rise in her face. The old heat, the Portland heat, the one she recognized from conference rooms and pitch meetings and 3 years of standing beside someone else's certainty in her own work. She breathed it down, slow and steady, the way she breathed down a thread that had started to pull. "You've told me what I've walked into," she said. "Let me tell you what I brought." She gestured at the cloth on the frame, at the drafts pinned around it, at the 8 years of annotated sketchbooks laid open on the side table. I'm not competing with Abe. He'll show a future. I'm making an argument about a present. Those are different jobs. I only need to be better at mine. Ray looked at her for a long moment. Then, startlingly, she laughed. Small, brief, and gone. You are going to be a great deal of trouble, she said. She looked at Kenji then, and something passed between them, an old current, underground, and still live. And Neva filed it away with the grandmother's silk and the loom that ran until 9. Ray went upstairs. Kenji paused at the base of the stair. You didn't need to do that, he said low to Neva. She opened it in English, so I'd have to answer in English, Neva said. I answered. Something in his face eased, the approach of an expression he wasn't yet ready to name. Come upstairs when you reach a stopping point, he said. You should hear the numbers. A designer who doesn't know what the cloth is defending is only making decoration. She heard them on the landing first, because old buildings carry sound without asking permission. Ray's voice. She has no working papers. 4 days in the country. If Orsini's team challenges her credentials during the presentation, and they will, because I will see that the question is raised, you have no answer. Kenji, her credentials are in the cloth. Anyone who has looked at it is moved by it. I understand that. I have also looked at it. A pause. I looked into her. Neva Strand. Portland. There was a studio, a partnership, a public dissolution. Her name on the liability side of the structure, his name on the assets. She left with nothing legally defensible. The voice dropped, careful in the way that was somehow worse than cruel. That is who you have built Friday around. A woman who has already put her name on one man's ruin and had it collapse on her. Neva stood on the landing with her hand on the stair rail and the indigo smell of the workshop below her, and felt the old pull. The one that said, you see, you were right to doubt yourself. Go before they ask you to. And she waited for it to pass, the way you wait out a warp that has pulled too tight before easing the tension back. Then she walked down the last 3 steps into the room. Both of them turned, Ray at the window. Kenji near the center of the room with the stillness she had learned meant a storm held behind glass. Mori-san, Neva said. I came down because I don't want to be deciding a landing. She looked at Ray. You've been thorough. Let me save you the last item. There was a studio. It dissolved. My name is on the liability because I signed the structure without reading what it was, which is a mistake I made at 26 when I trusted someone who had the language for it and I didn't. That is true, and it is a liability. She paused. You left out the part where I'm still standing. Ray's expression did not move. Standing in someone else's studio with no papers is not the triumph you're framing it as. It's not a triumph. It's Thursday. Neva looked at Kenji. What I need you to know is that everything in that cloth downstairs, I built from patterns that were mine before I ever met Grant Hollis. My sketchbooks go back to graduate school. 11 years, every page dated in my hand. A breath. He kept the studio address. He never once kept a process file. That was always my job. I brought the files. Kenji held her gaze for a moment, and she felt the weighing of it. The same weighing he applied to a finished bolt, checking tension, checking truth. Then I would like to propose something, he said. He turned to Ray, and his voice carried the particular flatness of a man who has made a decision and is no longer inviting debate. Thursday evening, before the board vote. You, myself, and Monsieur Takeda, the most skeptical of my 3 investors. She presents the finished cloth. If it fails to move him, we discuss credentials and alternatives. If it does not fail, he looked at Ray evenly, then you stop raising the papers question and we let the work be its own argument on Friday. Ray did the arithmetic. Neva could see her doing it. The cost of a yes, the cost of a no in front of the man whose name was on the building. Thursday evening, Ray said at last. Takeda is the least sentimental of the 3. If she cannot persuade him, she cannot persuade anyone. She picked up her tablet. Do not thank me, Miss Strand. I have given you a shorter rope. Some people climb. She left and the studio exhaled. Thursday evening, the front room had been cleared and the long table set with the finished cloth across it. 3 meters of silk, indigo and cream and persimmon. The grandmother's pattern in the left margin answered, thread by Neva's interpretation in the right. The wabi element placed like a breath held and released. Someone had put a single iris in a plain cup at the corner of the table, Mrs. Horio. Neva did not ask. Takeda was 81, compact, with the unhurried certainty of a man who had spent decades deciding things and had stopped finding the act dramatic. He looked at the cloth for 45 seconds without speaking. Then he picked up one edge and turned it over to examine the back. He looked at the back for a long time. This section, he said, in careful English, pointing to the margin where the two patterns met. The left is old, the right is new, but they are speaking to each other. Yes, Neva said. Like a letter and its reply. That was what I was trying to make. He set the edge down carefully. He looked out the studio window for a moment, at the persimmon tree in the last of the evening light. My mother wove, he said. Not like this. A simpler pattern. Every winter she made a bolt for whichever grandchild was marrying that year. She finished the last one the week she died. He looked at his folded hands. My youngest sister received it at her wedding and could not speak through the ceremony. I have not thought of that bolt in. He shook his head. He looked at Neva, and the unhurried certainty had gone somewhere else, replaced by something older and less defended. Where did you learn to make a thing that says something that is not on the cloth? From someone who learned from someone, Neva said. That's what the work is. Takeda was quiet. Then he nodded once, with the gravity of a man acknowledging a debt. I will tell the others, he said to Kenji, that the old pattern is still alive. The rest is their own business. He rose. I came to be unimpressed, he added, to no one in particular. I was not given that option. He left with Ray, who paused at the door and looked back at Neva with an expression that had lost its appraising quality and gained something that surprised her. Recognition. One clear, unguarded look, woman to woman, and then it was gone. It is genuinely good work, Ray said. She did not smile. Friday, I make no promises. But I will stop suggesting that your papers are Orsini's business to raise. She looked at Kenji once, briefly, with something set down carefully between them, and then she was gone, and the door settled on the summer dark. Grant Hollis arrived the following afternoon, 2 hours before the board sat. He came through the Norran curtain with the easy confidence of a man who had never been anywhere that didn't eventually make room for him, took in the silk and the looms and Neva, in her work clothes with indigo at her wrists, and he smiled the warm smile that had cost her 3 years and a studio and a great deal of sleep. There she is, he said. I knew you'd land on your feet, Neva. Let's talk about the patterns. He had a lawyer's folder under his arm. The folder contained a letter threatening a legal claim over the visual language she had developed during their partnership. It did not contain a filed suit, a registered IP claim, or any documentation of authorship, because, as she had told him from this city 3 nights ago, Grant Hollis had never once kept a process file. Neva laid all 8 sketchbooks on the table beside his folder. Let's read them, she said. She opened the oldest, battered black cover, spine held with a rubber band, pages dense with her graduate school handwriting, and turned it so he could see the date on the first entry. 11 years ago, 7 years before any studio existed between them. She opened the next, and the next, the dates marching forward in her hand, the patterns building on themselves, annotated in the margins with her cramped notes and self-corrections, and the occasional small profanity when something refused to work. Ray was in the room. She had come to speak with Kenji about formally withdrawing the Orsini acquisition interest and had simply not left. She watched the sketchbooks open, and her face, for the first time all week, was entirely without calculation. There is no filing, she said after a moment. She had crossed to the table and opened Grant's folder herself, reading with the swift efficiency of someone accustomed to contracts. There's a letter threatening a filing. There is no registered claim, no assignment of designs to any corporate entity, no documentation of authorship, because the authorship was never documented by anyone except her. She set the folder down. She looked at Grant with an expression Neva recognized because she had worn it herself in an emptied Portland apartment, the cold, flat clarity of someone seeing in another person the mechanism that had once been run on them. You flew to Kyoto on a bluff, she said. You thought a woman with nowhere to go would fold before anyone read the pages. Grant looked between Ray and Neva and Kenji and the open sketchbooks and did the final arithmetic, the kind that comes out the same way no matter how many times you run it. He picked up his folder. He did not say goodbye. Horio appeared from the back room with the impeccable timing of a woman who had been managing exits for 26 years, walked him to the door, and the Norran curtain settled behind him. And Grant Hollis's part of the story went out into the Kyoto afternoon and did not come back. Ray stood at the table with the 8 sketchbooks open before her. She looked at them a long time. When she looked up, her composure had not cracked, exactly, but there was a hairline running through it, fine and real. I wrote a clause, she said to Kenji. It was the most direct thing she had said all week, in the acquisition terms. a provision allowing Orsini to accelerate the purchase if the studio could not demonstrate a credentialed design lead under contract by the board vote. I wrote it 6 months ago to force your timeline. She paused. It was clever. It did exactly what it was built to do. She looked at the sketchbooks, then at Neva. That is a sentence I have heard this week in a different form. I did not enjoy recognizing myself in it. She reached into her bag and took out a single page, the acquisition clause, her copy, and held it a moment. The clause is mine. I can withdraw it. Her voice was even, but the cost of it was visible. The way the cost of anything real is visible if you look at the right angle. Orsini will not forgive me quickly for this. I have represented their interest for 6 years. Withdrawing the mechanism that guaranteed the sale is not a small thing, and I will spend a great deal of the next year explaining it. She looked at Neva, and there it was, the flash of kinship, no longer half hidden. That is my provenance. I opened my own folder. She folded the page once and tore it along the crease, and set the pieces beside Neva's oldest sketchbook. And the small dry sound it made was the loudest thing that had happened in the studio all afternoon. Your papers are a real problem, she said to Neva, without warmth but also without cruelty. There is no clause left to make it urgent, but it remains a problem. Kenji knows lawyers who can solve it with time. Use them. She looked between the two of them once, with the expression of someone setting something down that had been heavy for a long time. It is a good studio, she said quietly. I had almost let myself forget what I was recommending they buy. And she gathered her things and she went, and the door settled behind her and the studio exhaled. The board voted that evening before the tea was finished. Takeda voted first and said only, the letter and its reply. The second board member, who had promised himself he would be objective, forgot to be, for reasons he could not articulate except that the cloth had made him remember being 11 years old in his grandmother's house on a winter Sunday. The third member abstained, which in practice meant the same as yes, because he was unwilling to be the man who closed a workshop that made cloth like that. Mori Studio would not be sold to the Orsini Group. The announcement was made before 9 o'clock. Some weeks later, on a September morning when the persimmon tree had begun to turn, the Noren curtain at the front of the studio had been replaced. The old one, geometric stern, had been taken down for washing, and a new one hung in the threshold, the one Neva had woven in the nights after the vote. Indigo and cream, the grandmother's repeat in the left panel and something new in the right, open, still in conversation, still reaching. Kenji had looked at it for a long time on the morning she hung it. He had not said anything, which she understood by then was his most complete form of approval. Her papers came through the honest way, with time instead of a deadline, sponsored by a studio that now had a credentialed creative director under a contract that had her name on it, where it had always belonged. She still carried all 8 sketchbooks. She had bought a 9th and begun it the week she arrived, dated in her own hand, the way her graduate advisor had taught her, and the way she would teach Kyoto when it was time. A pattern without a date is a rumor. A pattern with a date is a witness. Darby called on Sundays and took full credit for everything. I threw you into the deep end, she said, and you built a pool. Mrs. Horio corrected Neva's warp tension twice a week and never acknowledged doing so, which Neva had come to understand was its own form of instruction. Takeda sent a card every month that said only the letter and its reply, and Neva kept the cards on the shelf beside the grandmother's unfinished bolt, which Mrs. Horio had brought down from the high shelf at the start of October and had not yet moved back up, which meant she had decided, in her private and unannounced way, that the someone the cloth had been kept for had finally come. Kenji had learned to say what he meant. Slowly, one sentence at a time, with the care of a man who understood that precision was a form of respect. He had told her about his grandmother properly, not the museum version. A woman who corrected his tension at 7 years old with 2 words, and waited with the patience of someone who had been waiting for the craft itself her entire life, until he understood why. He had told her about the year the studio had nearly closed before, in a different decade, and how his grandmother had answered that year not with speeches but by starting a new piece. Something atemtures and unmistakably alive, because she understood that the argument for continuation was the act of continuing. One evening in October, at the work table where she had laid her sketchbooks against an empty folder and one, with the persimmon light coming sideways through the studio windows and the click of Mrs. Horio's loom in the back room and the season turning outside, Kenji set down the draft he was annotating and said, without preamble, I would like you to pass the end of your contract. Neva kept her eyes on her own work for a moment. How far past? He turned the ring on his finger once, his grandmother's ring, which he wore on his right hand, and which she had learned to read as the external sign of something internal being decided. "Indefinitely," he said, "if that is something you want." She looked at him then, at the careful face with the careful eyes, and the door that had been opening by inches since the afternoon she turned his silk bolt over to show him the clean back. "I came to Kyoto to disappear," she said. "I know," he met her eyes. "You were very bad at it." The laugh surprised her, clean and genuine, the kind that comes up from somewhere that has been quiet too long and is glad to not be quiet anymore. "I'll stay," she said. "I already told Grant I wasn't coming back. It seems only fair you get the same sentence the better way around." He didn't smile. He didn't need to. The door had been open for a while, and they had both been in the same room for a while, and outside the persimmon tree was doing what persimmon trees do in October, which is to turn everything they hold the color of something you didn't know you'd missed until you saw it again. Neva Strand had come to Kyoto to escape her past. What she found there was not an escape. It was a studio where the looms had never been allowed to go silent, a woman who brought down an unfinished bolt every winter without being asked, a man who understood that the argument for a thing's worth was the act of making the thing, and a table long enough to lay 11 sketchbooks on, all at once, so that anyone who needed to see the truth could see it. The city she had come to disappear inside had refused, gently and completely, to let her stay invisible, and that, it turned out, was the whole point of coming. If this story stayed with you, if you believe that the ones who kept the records, who dated every page, who carried their work across an ocean because they could not leave it behind, are stronger than anyone gave them credit for, stay with us here at Golden Diaries. Subscribe, and let the next story find you. There is always a loom running somewhere in this house. And there is always room for someone who shows up and knows the difference between a pattern that is beautiful and a pattern that is true.